In January 1327, Queen Isabella and her ally Roger Mortimer held a remarkable parliament. In the months prior, Isabella and Mortimer had arrested King Edward II, Isabella's husband, and killed his closest allies, the Despensers, in brutal fashion. Edward was being kept in captivity at Kenilworth Castle, where, it was said, his living conditions were relatively comfortable. However, his time as king was about to be brought to an end. The Earl of Leicester, as well as the bishops of Winchester and Lincoln, held a secret meeting with the king to try and persuade him of the benefits of surrendering his crown to his 14-year-old son, Prince Edward. First, they played on the king's piety and conscience by implying that the king could expect religious rewards if he were to give up the crown. They also made it plain that it would benefit England as a country were Edward to surrender his throne, and they claimed there would be a return to peace and stability in the country. However, gentle persuasion was not the only tactic used by the two bishops and earl. They also employed threats, such as the possibility of Prince Edward being disinherited, also if King Edward did not comply. Reluctantly, the king realized he had very little option. He was, after all, a prisoner of Isabella and Mortimer, and they now held all the cards. However, Edward's deposition would not bring about the peace that the bishops and earl had effectively promised. Arriving at Kenilworth Castle soon after was the Bishop of Hereford, a key supporter of Isabella and Mortimer, along with a number of knights, barons, abbots, and bishops from across the country. Edward, on seeing them, was evidently overwhelmed with emotion and fainted. After some assistance, the king recovered himself and faced the Bishop of Hereford, who addressed him and told the king that it was his duty to hand over the crown, and that if Edward did not do so, then another man would be elected not only in Edward's stead, but also in place of the young Prince Edward. The king was left with no choice but to accept. Homage to Edward from the nobility was then formally renounced, and other formalities took place before Edward was officially declared to be no longer king. His son was now King Edward III. Isabella and Mortimer, now regents for the young boy king, would do very well for themselves financially. As for Edward II, he remained in the custody of the Earl of Leicester. The former king's upkeep was maintained by a relatively generous pension paid to him by the treasury. Edward is said to have borne his troubles manfully and complained little, although he despaired that his estranged wife not only refused to visit him, but also prevented the young king from seeing his father also. Whilst Edward bemoaned his pitiable situation, Isabella remained unmoved. Fearful of Edward becoming too familiar with his keeper, the Earl of Leicester, Isabella had her husband carted around the country. First of all, he was taken to Corfe Castle, then to Bristol, before he was eventually settled at Berkeley Castle, where Edward's life would become much harder and where it would also meet its end. Meanwhile, Isabella and Mortimer's power continued to grow at an alarming rate, and anyone who dared to challenge them could expect confiscation of money and property, and possibly death as well. Edward's guards at Berkeley were certainly of a harder disposition than those at Kenilworth. They taunted the former king and placed a crown of hay upon his head. Edward, though, remained steadfast despite these obvious provocations, but it was clear that whilst Edward remained alive, he was still a threat to the self serving and power mad pair, Isabella and Mortimer. The two regents were making new enemies all the time, and Edward was a clear figurehead for potential rebellions. Whilst Edward was alive, there was every possibility he could be set free and return to power. And so, one night in September 1327, Edward II died at Berkeley Castle. The most famous story that has circulated around Edward's death is that he was killed by a red hot poker, which is unlikely, but there is certainly an air of mystery surrounding the death of the former king. Whilst Edward had been a pretty poor king, it is hard not to feel some sympathy for him. Isabella and Mortimer's regency was no better than Edward's reign had been, and it could be said that Edward was far less malicious as a man. However, their time would be short, and in 1330 Isabella and Mortimer were brought crashing down to earth by the now maturing 17-year-old King Edward III, who had his mother exiled in disgrace and Roger Mortimer hanged at Tyburn.